So I guess today is someone from the intersection of the worlds of finance and energy, and is a person that I've looked to for quality information for many years. He's based in Australia. He spent a lot of his time focused on the energy transition in Asia and India specifically. Even though I'm not personally all that vested in India's energy transition, the work and analysis that he's produced over the years really does capture your imagination. And I've followed many of the pieces that he's written or talked about. He brings a really positive and engaging style to the world of numbers, and that together with, I think, his incredible knowledge and great communication skills means that it really brings people along on that journey. I'm looking forward to picking his brain today and hopefully learning a bit more. I'm pleased to welcome Tim Buckley from Clean Energy Finance. G'day, Tim.
G'day, nice to be with you today.
How's your day going so far?
Brilliant. The wind down pre-Christmas, things are quiet. Time to actually try recover from the massive year that 2023's been, and to get back up to speed on some of my reading.
Brilliant. Well, I bet you got a fair bit of reading to do with, both with new energy policy and energy targets coming out, with COP28 just finishing in Dubai. A lot of interesting things to digest. So, but perhaps before we talk about some of that, it'd be great to hear a little bit more about your background. What kind of interests did you have as a kid growing up, and how did you kind of get to the point where you're at today in terms of creating climate energy finance and so on?
Sure. My vocation has always been finance. I've been fascinated by the world of the stock market and the financial system, and that started at an early time of life, and I ended up managing director, head of research at Citigroup, which at the time was the biggest bank in the world. And I did that for 20 years, but at the end of the day, a big but. It's certainly my vocation, but it's certainly not a job that was doing a lot of good for the world. And banking, as I think I say in a lot of my posts, is a very amoral system. It's not immoral, but it is there to deal with what's in finance called the sole purpose test. Finance has to maximize the risk-adjusted returns for its investors, for its clients. And that's part of the issue that I now work in the public interest think tank space, trying to get the government to create the right policy framework so that finance can be mobilized to resolve the climate crisis, because it's a globally pressing crisis. But I'm also of the view that finance is phenomenally powerful, and you give it the right policy framework, give it the right price signal, and I think everyone will be amazed at how quickly finance can be mobilized to solve the energy and climate crisis of the world.
Mm. So as a young kid, were you a bit of a nerd at school? Did you like maths? How did you sort of get into finance to begin with?
My father was passionately interested in it. I used to be very interested in maths, but I also had a pretty diverse education. I ended up doing economics and history as well as maths as sort of my three priorities. And then I always knew I wanted to get into finance, but I ended up doing a UTS business degree. And that was certainly never looked back from there, but it's always been more finance as opposed to corporates. One day I thought, I might be a CEO of a company. Then I realized, look, finance is completely different from corporates. It is very, very different. It's very different from economics as well. And it's fascinating. And the speed of finance is something that's like adrenaline junkie, maybe. Every day is different. Every day is exciting. And it's amazing how fast finance can move. And so I always found it very, very stimulating. But for the last 10 years, I've been running a public interest think tank, and that is trying to mirror my financial skills and my interest and passion for finance with actually leaving the world a better place.
Brilliant. And you can tell us a bit about the type of work that you do for businesses?
Yeah, so we don't do any paid consultancy. So everything we do is public interest. We have no paid clients. We're funded by some very special philanthropists who see the value of public advocacy, and they see the power of finance and the need for the price signal. I mean, to me, it's really obvious, and any economist you talk to will say the same thing, that we need a price on carbon. But unfortunately, we had that a decade ago. Australia was a world leader and it became a political football. And so now, a decade later, even a decade later, a price on carbon is toxic in the Australian landscape. I think the Murdoch media's help keep it toxic, even though it's the obvious, a whole of economy price signal is the obvious solution. And I mean, even the old Productivity Commission that used to highlight that. Point one, they would never talk about climate, but they would talk, well, if you want to solve the climate crisis, just put a price on carbon. It's still the obvious thing. And that's really what I spend a lot of my time grappling with today, because without a price on carbon, how do you convince finance to mobilize at the speed and scale the science dictates? And the answer is you can't. And so that's where I'm really, really heartened by the work that the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, and the Finance Minister, Katie Gallagher, are working on. They have transformed the public government thinking in the last 18 months. And we saw in December of this year, 20 of the top finance CEOs of Australia in a roundtable with the federal government, the Treasurer's roundtable, talking about how we mobilise the $3.5 trillion of public pension capital to solving the climate crisis. And all of those CEOs were saying to the government, we're very happy to solve the problem for you. We're happy to mobilise hundreds of billions of dollars, but you've got to give us the right policy certainty, the right policy framework before we can step up. And so that's really what I've been arguing about for a decade. And it's brilliant now to see that 20 of the top finance executives, CEOs in Australia are all arguing the same thing. The government's and giving the government the mandate and the confidence to do it, because I think for all, I am very encouraged by what Chalmers and what Prime Minister Albanese are doing. They don't feel they've got strong enough climate mandate from the people of Australia. And so they don't have the confidence to actually act in alignment with the climate science in terms of the urgency and the scale and the speed of policy response required.
And so for the pension funds, where there is so much money available, hopefully to really amp up the energy transition and our response to climate change, what are some of those key pieces of policies that can really help unlock? Obviously, it's got to do with certainty and long-term buy-in, but what are some of those things specifically that they're asking for to put more money on the table?
Well, I think we actually got one of those, which is why I'm very good at throwing rocks at government and at ministers. But Chris Bowen, the Energy and Climate Minister, kicked a beautiful goal on last month with his capacity investment scheme. So the capacity investment scheme, it was effectively a fourfold expansion of the federal government underwriting of battery energy storage and renewable energy infrastructure projects, working in partnership with the various state governments to accelerate the deployment of firmed renewable energy infrastructure at the speed and scale required to deliver on the 82% renewables by 2030. And that policy certainty and that financial underwriting is key to mobilising the pension capital, but also the banking capital. So if we think of CommBank, they manage $1 trillion of assets in our country. So they've got the biggest balance sheet by a country mile. Like, they're 3 times bigger than BHP in terms of the assets, but without a price signal, they are really struggling to actually do the right thing. And so I was really, really heartened that CommBank 2-3 months ago introduced a target to decarbonise their Australian housing loan book by 60% by 2030. You might think, oh, have I just gone off on a massive tangent? And I have. But the reality is CommBank can't deliver on a 60% decarbonisation of their residential loan book without the 82% renewables that Minister Bowen has put in place. And in fact, it is the 82% renewables which has given CommBank the confidence to do that. And that then means the biggest company and the biggest financial institution in Australia, CommBank, is now mobilizing its balance sheet to actually encourage the household sector to decarbonize their housing. Now, it's actually really easy to decarbonize your house if you're lucky enough to be a house owner. Obviously, that comes with a mortgage, and that's where CommBank or the four big banks come into effect. But if they actually give you the right financial tools to actually help you decarbonize, that is the straightest, easiest way to mobilize. We've already seen that. Australia's putting in 3.2 gigs a year of rooftop solar. AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, just put out their integrated system plan. They're talking about Australia having 85 gigawatts of rooftop solar by 2050, 4 times what we've got today, where we're already in 2023, the world's per capita #1 player. And AEMO's modeling that we're going to actually lift rooftop solar 4-fold within just 27 years. Now, that is staggering speed and scale of capital. And when I talk about 85 gigawatts of rooftop solar, that's an $85 billion investment. The Australian consumers, the household sector will do that. They're going to need players like CommBank and Westpac to help them. And CommBank and Westpac have now just made a formal board policy to do that, because Minister Bowen's got the courage and the spine to actually introduce a really ambitious 82% renewables. And what he was hearing all year was, oh, we're not on track for 82% renewables. So 3 weeks ago, Minister Bowen stepped up with Jim Chalmers, with Katie Gallagher, and put the Australian federal balance sheet on the line to say, let's make sure we've got the right policy framework to de-risk investment, and that will mobilise hundreds of billions of dollars of capital. And that is the sort of policy framework that we need to mobilise the private sector. And at the end of the day, that's the sort of work I work towards, and that's the sort of policy initiative. Create the right policy framework, then get out of the way and let finance do it, let private finance do it, let the households do it, let the corporates do it, create the right policy framework.
Yeah, fantastic. It certainly sounds like we're putting some of the right policies in place to unlock some of that capital. And as you say, households in Australia have historically been very responsive to I guess, financial incentives to put rooftop solar on their roofs and be really be a part and lead the change. I'm sure you would have seen the percentage of energy that's rooftop solar in the grid. It's pretty impressive today, but if you're going to continue and get another 85 gigawatts, they're going to keep leading that charge, which is pretty impressive. Obviously, with maybe just a little personal anecdote just to share. I would be on a house in Melbourne, a small townhouse, and we had that kind of incentive put to us from one of the smaller banks, Bank Australia, a few years ago. They had something called a clean energy upgrade loan, I think it was called. It meant that we could, if we implemented a number of energy efficiency upgrades, things like putting solar on the roof, a battery, an EV charger, energy monitor, that kind of thing. A number of those initiatives show that you've done them. We'll give you 40 basis points off your home loan, and then we'll lock that in for 5 years. I'm now very grateful to have a locked-in low rate. But I think those kind of things are really encouraging for the consumers, and they're very happy to jump on and be a part of that change. I think the banks have a really good leverage to incentivize consumers.
Absolutely. Now, Bank Australia has been a world leader in that space, but as they admit, they're a small player. We need the behemoths like CommBank and Westpac to move and replicate their leading efforts. Now, what I'm delighted to see, I had an amazing privileged meeting with the CSIRO, and the head of the CSIRO decarbonisation of housing project. So has been working on this for 4, 5, 6 years, investing. So that's where our taxpayer money has gone, and it's brilliant to see. So when CommBank says that they want to decarbonise 60% of their residential loan book by 2030, they're not doing it blind. They've actually working with the CSIRO and getting them to actually have an app which the mobile phone can do. So literally you use your mobile phone, you scan your residence for 15 minutes, you tick some boxes as to what's your insulation, how much double glazing have you got, how much rooftop solar have you got. And so the building envelope can be assessed within 15 minutes using your phone. Now that is a massive government investment through CSIRO to actually create the right tool so that you can cost effectively evaluate what is your house. Now that's the thermal efficiency, and then on top of that, the appliance efficiency. So do you have induction cooking? Do you have rooftop solar? Do you have the right appliances in there? Have you disconnected from gas? And so what that then allows the banks to do is to mobilize at massive scale in a cost-effective way. So that what you described was your house goes from maybe a 3-star to a 4-star neighbours rating. By the way, the federal government just legislated every new house in Australia, with the exception of the Northern Territory. We can come back to that or not. It's just depressing. Why would we make the most inhospitable territory in Australia not have good thermal efficiency? It's just criminal in my view that they got an exemption. But anyway, criminal, and it shows how we treat our First Nations people, but let's not go there. But anyway, so 7-star rated, all new houses from Australia from next year have to be 7-star. But what do we do about the existing $10 trillion of existing housing stock? And so these tools by the CSI are going to be rolled out. And that means you can then actually evaluate the change in your NAPFA's rating for your house. Each time you go from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, then the banks could actually work out, is there a value uplift? That can then actually help them evaluate, and then they can provide, as you said, an incentive for their customers to do the right thing. And it's not so much to do the right thing, but an incentive to provide the capital to allow them to do the right thing, and then to actually verify. So rather than you just doing it and then professing you've done the upgrades, they can monitor it, they can evaluate it, but they can do it cost effectively. And it won't be through the thought leaders, it'll be doing it across the mass market. And that then mobilizes. Australia's got an obscene $10 trillion invested in Australian housing. How do we mobilize that $10 trillion sector? It's by mobilising CommBank, Westpac, Macquarie, NAB, ANZ, and getting them to work with those house owners and with the investment property owners and all the landlords to get them to actually overcome the split incentive to do the right thing. And then we can help drive a massive sustained decarbonisation, electrification of everything, decarbonisation of everything. And then Australia becomes a world leader compared to the petro-state of old that we're unfortunately all too used to.
Talking about petrostates, maybe let's talk a little bit about different types of fuels in the economy and what the future looks like for each of them. Perhaps more so from an Australian perspective, but if you have some global thoughts on some of these, that would be good to hear as well. What does the future look like for, if we start off with brown coal and black coal?
Yeah, in Australia, we've just had the Integrated System Plan come out. AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, has just ruled that they expect the last coal-fired power plant to close within 15 years within Australia. Now, that includes brown coal, lignite, and black coal. So within 15 years, the last coal-fired power plant will close. Now, they're not doing it because they're being altruistic. They're modelling what is their expectation of what will happen in our market. And what they're seeing, number one, is the massive growth in solar means that every time it's sunny, which in Australia is sort of 99% of the time for a good 10 hours of the day, a coal plant is going to be losing money with every time they operate, and they have to operate. They're inflexible. They're 40-year-old clunkers. So therefore, for 10 hours a day, they're going to lose money. Now, what owner of a business is going to run a plant knowing that they're losing money with every unit of product that they sell? And because they're inflexible, that means the coal plants get gutted economically. Now, that's sort of the logic that got me involved in this space 10 years ago. But now it's even obvious to the Australian Energy Market Operator that these coal plants are going to close at the end of their useful life. They're not going to have extensions because they're not going to make viable returns. Now, I was actually just reading in China. Now, China is half the world's coal production, half the world's coal consumption. And China has just introduced a 2-tiered tariff. And I was talking with our China policy analyst this morning, Xu Yangdong. And I actually think it's a positive strategy where they've got a fixed price for the coal plant to cover their fixed costs each year. And then they've got a 2-part tariff. The second part is a variable tariff. Now, You might think it's a bit strange that someone advocating for climate science to be applied in finance is saying a two-part tariff makes sense. It makes sense in China because the Chinese government totally accepts and acts on the climate science. They're deploying 20 gigawatts, 20,000 megawatts of new wind and solar every month this year. 110% growth year on year. So China leads the world. In 3 months, they're deploying as much wind and solar as the entire Australian grid has installed in all types of fuel in the last 50 years. And they're doing that in 3 months in China. So they're absolutely wedded to decarbonisation, despite what the Murdoch press tells us every day. But what they're saying is, we don't have a lot of gas. We don't want to be reliant on American and Australian imported LNG, liquefied natural gas. They want to actually use what they've got. That's what Putin's told the world you have to do. You have to have energy security, number one, and then decarbonize, number two. And if you don't have energy security, you can't invest in sustainable economic activity. So China's saying, well, we're the biggest coal user in the world. We don't have a lot of oil. We don't have a lot of gas. So we're going to use what we've got, which is a lot of coal. And then we've got a lot of wind, a lot of solar, and a lot of hydro, and we're going to use all of them. And so they're building massive amounts of variable renewable energy. And so they're now putting it from the 1st of January 2024, they're putting in a very, very two-tiered pricing structure for their coal plants. So their coal plants can run flexibly. Now, the reason why the Chinese coal plants can run flexibly is they've just built them. They weren't built 40 years ago or 50 years ago as the coal clunkers in the Latrobe Valley and in the Hunter Valley of New South Wales were built. They were built 50 years ago. They were really obsolete technologies, so they will die because solar will gut them. And they die because we have to get rid of them and they're end of life, and no one's dumb enough to invest in a new coal-fired power plant in Australia because they'll be gutted by every time it's windy. They'll be gutted every time it's sunny. They'll be gutted. Whereas in China, the government doesn't want them gutted. They actually want a stable, reliable grid. And they can't use gas peakers. They can't build enough batteries fast enough. Now, by the way, they're the world's number one installer of batteries in the world by country mile. They're building 10 gigawatts a year of pumped hydro storage. Now, we're taking, 10 years, 15 years to build Snowy. They're doing 5 Snowies every year. Just to put the order of magnitude, China doesn't have a problem the way we do with Florence being stuck for 2 years, unable to move. They actually just resolve things. So I'm not in any way saying China isn't the world leader. They're the world leader in pumped hydro. They're the world leader in batteries. They're the world leader in solar. They're the world leader in onshore wind. They're the world leader in offshore wind. They're the world leader in electrolyzers, EVs, batteries, you name it. They're the world leader in everything. But their economy is enormous, and changing the Titanic means you've got to actually plan to do it orderly and systematically. So they're building brand new coal-fired power plants that are actually flexible. Right. Everything we tell the Australian government, our coal plants are not flexible. Theirs are, because they're brand new. And so they're deliberately saying we want them to run whenever it's not windy, whenever it's not sunny. And so we are assuming that they will run maybe a third of the time. Whereas when we were building coal plants 40, 50 years ago, we were aiming for them to run 70 or 80% of the time. And China's building them and planning them and paying them to run 1/3 of the time when it's not windy, when it's not sunny. In other words, that's their gas peaker, or that's their battery and pumped hydro and coal, flexible coal. But you can have flexible coal power when the plant's built in 2023. You can't have flexible coal when it was built in 1970.
Yeah, fair. That makes a lot of sense. And so for Australia then, with our old coal fleet, is gas the answer to help variable renewables, or is it a combination of, as per the ISP, is it a combination of energy storage, pumped hydro, and gas?
Yeah, the methane gas industry, the fossil fuel industry will tell us gas is absolutely the transition fuel. They've been telling us that for a decade. They've been getting the IEA to tell us for a decade. But as the IEA now says, the gas decade has actually expired. That was a decade ago. And we are now having to design an energy system that gets off the methane gas, because we know methane gas is toxic to a livable planet. And Woodside and Santos are selling us they're greenwash, they're lies, and we do need to get off the gas. So AEMO has just put out their integrated system plan. I think AEMO is a little too much funded by, or too much historic and too much worried about reliability, and they're thinking a little too conservatively. But I mean, I really respect what Daniel Westerman's doing with AEMO, the integrated system plan. They are moving as fast as they possibly can, but they did argue that the amount of gas peakers in Australia will go from, gas capacity will go from 10 gigawatts to 16 gigawatts. What they probably should have done in the next sentence is said, we actually forecast gas power generation is going to drop dramatically in the next decade.
Yep.
You know, that your capacity goes up, but your utilization rate drops through the floor, which means the gas peakers serve their role as grid reliability backups. So whilst we're stuffing around building snowy hydro for the next decade, whilst Queensland's spending, I don't know, $35 billion building 2 massive pumped hydro projects in Queensland, which will be operational at the end of next decade, we are going to have to keep grid reliability there, and a gas peaker can do it. But a gas peaker that is not turned on 99% of the time doesn't generate a lot of emissions. So let's not kid ourselves about the energy intensity of the grid. It is going down dramatically, permanently. It's clear what the direction is. It's clear it's accelerating. And whilst we're trying to get off the gas, while we're trying to get off fossil fuels, gas will play a transitional role. So a small, declining, but important role as we get off all things like 32 billion litres a year of oil imports. As we electrify everything, that'll reduce Australia's imports of 32 billion litres a year of oil, and that'll improve our energy security. That'll massively decarbonise our transport fleet, and that'll accelerate. And by the way, the batteries on wheels will then become a core part of grid reliability in 10 or 15 years. But I'd like AEMO to start working now on making sure we have bidirectional charging and that we leverage the power of the EVs. And AEMO has changed their thinking. They've started talking about EVs, or batteries on wheels, as a key resource asset for the grid, as opposed to a problem for the grid. 2 years ago, they were talking about, all these EVs are going to be a problem for the grid because they're going to increase demand for electricity. Well, last time I checked, increased demand is a good thing, particularly if you can actually have bidirectional charging, and that you and I and every other consumer can actually be paid to use the massive battery on wheels that's sitting in our car park or in our garage or in our driveway as a form of grid reliability. So you actually get paid for the power of your battery in your car. So
no, I agree. I think two of the things that really stood out for me in the ISP were both that fact that EVs are more and more considered a generation source as opposed to a load in the network, which is a really good development that AEMO is looking at it that way. I think the second one had to do with, just that fact around flexibility and how specifically in the wording they talked about energy storage, pumped hydro, and gas. And I think that really highlights, the fact that the declining nature of gas, of methane gas in the network. And I think thanks for using that term too. I think we've gotten away with too many decades of calling it natural gas as opposed to what it really is. So interesting.
No, absolutely. Greenwashing by the methane gas industry. For 40 years, AGL sold us gas is good, and they were lying, and the science tells us they were lying. They were greenwashing, and now, fortunately, ASIC, our regulator, is saying you can't greenwash. It is actually breaking the law, and they're punishing corporates and financiers who do break the law. So it's only taken us 40 years to actually get truth in advertising when it comes to methane gas.
Excellent. Now, we just wrapped up COP28. We're recording this now in about the middle of December. What was the biggest takeaways for you from COP28? What maybe let's start with the negative. What were some of the biggest disappointments from the conference?
Well, the fact that it was being hosted by a petrostate was always going to be problematic, but I'm a little careful about throwing rocks at the UAE or China, given Australia just voted no, and given we're a petrostate, we're the third largest petrostate in the world. So I suppose, set my expectations relatively low given the president of the COP, but I think he did a good job. And we actually got fossil fuels mentioned in the final text for the first time ever, which I find obscene that the fossil fuel industry's lobbyists have managed to keep fossil fuels out of the text for so long. And for the first time, we got renewable energy mentioned in the text as well. So at the end of the day, the ongoing corruption of democracy, the ongoing corruption of debate by vested interests is the perennial problem with every COP, not just COP28. I was pleasantly surprised that they put that aside and actually acted like leaders, which was lovely. And Minister Bowen made Australia act like a leader for the first time in, I don't know, a decade. And that was lovely to see.
Awesome. So we've got a lot of exciting years ahead in the energy transition in Australia. What excites you the most about the opportunity ahead for us as a country?
As Professor Ross Garnaut has been saying for, I don't know, 40 years, Australia will be a renewable energy superpower. I think we'll be a value-added mining superpower because we've actually got to embody decarbonisation in our exports before we export so that we can get the brilliant renewable energy resources of Australia to our trade partners. So when people frame it, oh, it doesn't matter what Australia does because we're only 1.5% of the world's emissions or 1.3% of the world's population, our domestic economy is small, so it doesn't matter what we do. I think that is deliberate misinformation. It should be banned because Australia is a petrostate, as Dr. Finkel has said. We are the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world, but we also can help drive a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% decarbonisation of the world's economies by exporting embodied decarbonisation in all that we export. And so we help Japan, China, Korea, India on their decarbonisation path. So Australia can play and is playing a world-leading role if we can do that at scale. And so I do really think Professor Ross Garnaut's work has been groundbreaking, and now we've had to refine it. He's refined it. Dr. Alan Finkel's refined it. I think Professor Saul Griffiths has helped refine electrify everything in Australia and really highlighted the value for the people of Australia from that. But I get more excited. Okay, decarbonising our domestic economy is a massive opportunity. It's the economically obvious thing to do, as Saul talks about all the time. But we can also help Japan, China, Korea, and India decarbonise. So that's probably 2 or 3 times the value. And we're now on that path. So I've been calling for Treasurer Chalmers to put $100 billion of our public capital and budget power on the table to crowd in 200 or 300 billion of private capital. And that's sort of leveraging the financial power of the Australian private capital base, $3.5 trillion. And I think that's the massive decade opportunity for Australia that's coming. I want Australia to be a world leader in exporting green iron, not green steel, but green iron. Do green steel for domestic use so that we learn by doing, but then we export we produce, I don't know, 5 million tons of green steel a year, of steel, all very, very dirty steel at the moment. But we export hundreds of millions of tons of iron ore, like 120, $130 billion of iron ore each year. If we were to export green iron, we could export 230 billion tons, $230 billion a year of green iron exports. That $100 billion uplift in value would all be embodied decarbonisation. That would be powering the cleaning up of our iron ore before we export it, doing the first step of processing so that the Japanese, Indian, Chinese and Korean steel industries, which collectively they're 70% of the world's steel production and consumption, that would help decarbonise the steel industry. And so Australia pivots our economy, leverages the renewable energy resources, and we export embodied decarbonisation. Now, That means the most important signal we need is a price on carbon in China, Japan, Korea, and India. And so I want a price on carbon in Australia. I love that Minister Bowen talks about an Australian CBAM, but I would far more love it if the Chinese government retaliated on the EU for the EU ETS by bringing in a Chinese ETS. Now, I use that word deliberately because the Chinese climate minister talked about the Indian, Piyush Goyal, the Indian minister this week, talked about retaliation against the EU ETS by India. And I go, don't retaliate, copy them, replicate them, crowd in, because that is exactly the signal Australia needs. A price on trade, international trade on carbon emissions is the price signal that BHP and Rio and Fortescue and Gina Rinehart, Hancock Prospecting absolutely need to mobilise investment to decarbonise and to seize $100 billion a year value-added opportunity for Australia. You can't do that without a price signal, and it won't be the Australian government that creates that price signal, or it won't be them in isolation. It'll be Minister Wong lobbying Japan and Korea to put a price on carbon in Japan and Korea first. They'll then encourage China to do it, and then India will come along for the ride because they need a huge amount of steel and they want to decarbonise. So all of a sudden, Australia's helping drive the right price signal to drive investment to help decarbonise Asia, the greater Asian market. And then Australia can hold our head up, unlike what we've been for the last decade, holding it down in shame.
Well, hugely fascinating. I think I'll probably speak for a lot of lay people in this space that I've learned a lot today. I certainly didn't think about, I probably thought more about how does Australia copy the IRA to get a lot of those benefits that are happening there. I'm sure you would agree that there were more positives in that. But personally, I haven't even thought of how do we get a price on carbon indirectly that has an impact similar to having it ourselves. That's really fascinating for someone like me. I'm really happy that you took the time today, Tim. Really appreciate it. I hope we can have a follow-up conversation at some point because you clearly have a lot of really good knowledge to share. So thanks for your time.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me, Johan.
Thank you.